So let's get started. Okay, so in my personal experience, just using stroke gestures for the last 2 years, I found that any hard-coded gestures start to feel a little too constrained. Even if I wrote them myself, my feelings, my moods change, and over time, the gestures that I use for various tasks change. So these are stroke-based gestures, but what we're mostly talking about in UTouch so far is physics-based gestures, where dragging fingers around has a direct physical implication, like equivalent to dragging a piece of paper around a table surface or anything like that. But I think as we progress further, individual users might find themselves drawn to gestures that are more meaningful to them. So the question really becomes, how much of this is worthwhile supporting? How configurable should it be? How do we get that done? So what sort of problems are we really looking at for this? And beyond stroke-based gestures, I really haven't thought too deeply into these live actions.
I'm fairly new to Ubuntu from Eclipse, but I've been doing a lot of stuff with gestures on the Magic Mouse on my MacBook Pro. So I'm kind of curious as to what your input devices are. I can tell you from experience what's worked there in the Apple devices. Okay,
so we are talking all the way from like the Magic Mouse to touch screens. Later on, probably plus Maddie, at some point in the future, it will be very important to talk about multi-user tables, conference tables, or just large displays.
Is this a mature one to Linaro?
I think that the smaller the Slate device stuff and the small screen stuff will. But at the moment, the focus is more on screens around this size, a little bit smaller, but not here. 3-inch? Or are you guys really thinking about that?
Well, I don't think it really. People use 2 fingers on their phones just fine. I don't think it's something. It's just a software.
Yeah, it's not fundamentally different. At least I'm not seeing a huge fundamental difference. One thing is that there's a bit of scaling as opposed to if you're doing something. Well, if you're doing something on the phone, it still physically maps your fingers. So if you're doing something on the Magic Mouse, you expect it to scale versus following the, if you move an inch, you expect the thing on screen to move a bit more than an inch.
Right.
Sometimes.
Okay, yeah, I guess. So there's a question. Okay, another question. Another example which has come up is talking about configuration of parameters. So the single-click, double-click. The double-click timeout is something that is an ancient configuration that people are used to. So when we're talking about things like
accessibility is a required configuration.
Oh, okay. Didn't realize it was actually required. Okay, but when we're talking about translation, rotation, and scaling, we might have points with affinity. So if you're rotating, if you get close to 45 degrees, sometimes you want it to feel really sticky around 45, so it snaps to it. And of course, 90-degree increments, 45-degree increments would be fine. But you might want a different affinity for the 90s. So being able to say what the range is of affinity and how strong it is might be some sort of options that we want.
But is this?
So I want to cut through the theory and give a very clear statement of where we will go in Ubuntu and with UTouch. We're not going to encourage deep user configuration of lots of parameters in the touch system for the simple reason that that deeply fragments the user experience. Instead, we're going to project a strong set of values and interfaces that applications can subscribe to. So in your example, there are what we call notched rotations. Like sometimes it makes sense that you could rotate fractions of a degree, and every fraction counts. But often you're really talking about either a fixed 90 or 45 or some specific transformations. The standard mechanism for applications to express that they have a notched, that they're interested in notched rotation, and what the notches are. The system will determine all the appropriate thresholds so that it can do it whenever you've got a 45-degree notch thing. In every application, the experience is exactly the same. Whether it's Qt, whether it's GTK, it's exactly the same experience.
But you might...
I don't.
Oh.
So we provide one other mechanism, and that is a mechanism for the application to say, in this region of the window or in this window, I don't want you to do any gesture interpretation. I'm going to essentially interpret every touch myself. But that would be a very rare circumstance. That is for multi-finger paint applications which don't want to get tripped up, in terms of semantic gestures versus actual paint, or very specialized applications like CAD applications, which might need a much richer gesture vocabulary. The standard Linux thing of everything is configurable every different way is not the value we're trying to project here, for very good design reasons. And I think extended conversations here on the subject are potentially only holding us back from doing a better job of getting the baseline standard design user experience right.
There are going to be stuff that you want to provide for accessibility reasons, so timing in particular can be
Very, very high level parameters.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Okay, but what about different classes of applications having only slightly different feels? So, like, you would probably want a slightly different feel for a photo editor versus Inkscape. So, manipulating a rectangle in Inkscape, you might have your preferences versus IOGNOME we're talking about, where the user might want free rotation without snap.
So the difference between free rotation and some sort of notched rotation can be clearly expressed. App vendors can decide whether they want to be creating a free rotation experience or a notched rotation experience, and the system will handle the interpretation of the
So
gestures.
then you're thinking the applications tells the system.
The application says, look, I want a notched rotation experience, and there's a set of parameters that the application can express. But that's it. We don't want a situation where your mail client responds to drags differently to your browser or your something else. It's a rat hole that we just don't want to go down.
It makes programming easier too.
So what other forms of configuration?
I was thinking perhaps not so much configuration, but confirmation of gestures. So some people will not get the exact gesture, and perhaps you can relate to that when you're talking about the alphabet.
Well, yesterday...
So, yes, there was a session on that yesterday morning.
Yeah, yesterday we were talking about visualization of gestures.
Yeah,
So if we're approaching a snap, you might see something like a ghost of where the window will be when you lift your fingers.
Right, but if your way of expressing those gestures does not match exactly or close enough the gestures that we have, I think we could provide a way for someone to say, okay, that gesture, that one, I know what it looks like, this is how I express it, and that would be the extent of the configuration that we provide.
So give us an example.
So for example, if you get a brand new, at the time, I don't know now, but if you would get a brand new Palm Pilot, you would train the device to recognize your own way of expressing the alphabet, which for many people is different. And then once you were done, the system would know, oh, that's your A? Okay.
So I think that's valuable. I think a graffiti style interface will be useful to us, and we should figure out how to support that. Right. That's separate to gestures where you're talking about, you're then conveying data, right? You're saying A, D, right? But gestures are more about conveying timing, spacing, physical translation, points on the screen.
Correct. So I'm wondering if there's any value in saying, gee, I can't figure out why, but I'm not able to rotate the way I think rotation is. doesn't work. Okay, what do you think rotation is for you? Not change it system-wide for
Again.
everyone, just
Okay, so if we configure it, say somebody, instead of rotating their hand, most people, our assumption right now is that they're all around a single center. So you're moving in parts,
Yeah.
it's not a single point.
I think it's going to fall under accessibility, because people with different disabilities may not physically be able to do the gestures that the bulk of us can.
Right, so,
And so this is where maybe where those customizations are really important.
I see the value of a certain amount of training to a particular shape of hand or something like that, flexibility in a wrist. But I also see the value in being able to sit down at any device and essentially have a predictable experience. You know,
That's why I think it's more of an accessibility thing versus a general user thing. Because I agree with
so
the consistency.
the guidance on this
user
is that, the
experience
guidance is
paramount.
this is that we will find alternative mechanisms, whether it's speech, whether it's so at this stage you're not going to complicate the gesture.
What if it comes down to a situation where you say that you, for whatever reason, you only have 3 fingers that you can easily use, and you want to use Unity stuff? If we had an accessibility menu that most people would not go to with the intention of, oh, I just want to make my system behave differently or whatever, but they just provide some accessibility-driven options just for specific use cases where you can't use all of your fingers that we expect that a normal user would be able to.
so for the 3-finger case, one thing that we discussed is having an option where you put down 3 fingers and tap one and put it back down to treat it as a 4th finger.
But in our world of gesture languages, that is a completely different phrase than 4-finger touch,
Okay.
right? 3-touch, lift and tap is a compound gesture. So we're not gonna
For an accessibility option.
You're not hearing me. We're not going to special case things like that, because then we're tramping all over the language space, right? So what we might do is we might say you could use a key press in combination, right?
Yeah.
We might say, for example,
Just
the
like
4th finger and 4-finger gestures isn't really hugely relevant other than to tell you that it's there, or perhaps for timing purposes. So we might be able to substitute a finger for a key on some of the higher order gestures. So that's the sort of thing we could do. But compound gestures have meaning in our gesture language. So we can't essentially go special casing compound gestures as single gestures, because then apps that depend on the compound gestures are going to be compromised.
Yes.
It's like using the letter E as a hotkey. Not a good idea. Right?
So I don't think this is relevant for 11.04 necessarily, but if anybody's ever seen Windows 7 Touchpad, they have a short tutorial. So like it basically says like, okay, here's the gesture to do this, now try it. And it basically tells you whether you got it right or not. And it gives you a little visual guide. So, you know, for people who say, well, what if you're just not getting the gesture quite right? Well, maybe we give you tools to basically practice the gesture.
Right, and if we could crowdsource the data from something like that and see, okay, people on this device are struggling, that it's just focus our attention on a particular device. Or, in fact, our interpretation should be slightly skewed because everybody's hands are slightly skewed in average ways.
Right.
That's very useful.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah. I think the accessibility one is not necessarily an invalid case, but again, I think it's not something we need to worry about in this cycle. I think we need to get the basics down first, and then we can extend the solution to fit more users' needs.
Consistency in gestures is critically important.
Yes.
We're lacking the discoverability. We're going to do as many gesture previews as we can, but we're still lacking the visual clues that people are used to. We need a world where you can go to your friend's computer, like you can pick up a mouse, and you can use it. You can go and use gestures, and it can work. We really have to be very strong on having kind of consistency in both the gesture interpretation and, as far as possible, consistency in the actions performed by the gestures.
So I absolutely agree on the design aspect and keeping everything consistent. I think one argument for maybe leaving one way of configuring finite parameters is that someone mentioned people might do the gestures a little bit different. But regardless of that, I think different input devices might actually give you slightly different data. So you might have to calibrate to specific input devices.
Okay, so that we should do.
Paul Sladen puts it very nicely there. saying it's a lot easier to train the human to match the computer than match the computer to the human. So, for example, the training program that he described, combined with real-time feedback of which gestures we're registering, which allow people to kind of course correct, is I think likely to be the winning strategy. Combined with some sort of deeper wisdom about human hands and general behavior.
Well, the way you describe it, we could actually ask the user, we take the data of how many times they fail to do a particular gesture. So we can realize that, this particular gesture, the average user fails 3 times before they get it right.
Right.
Is that something people are used to in other applications? If you take a more niche example, perhaps the fingerprint readers application and how they read your thumb, they train to recognize you. Oh, you failed these many times. So we already have examples of that.
Absolute failure of performing gestures is more likely something you'll encounter when performing repeated or magic gestures. When the gestures are moving physical objects or pointing, it's more you start performing the gesture and something starts moving immediately. It's not performing the magic swipe that can be recognized or not be recognized. So then such one important kind of behavior most likely.
So you think that might be a better answer.
So are we speaking about 2 levels of configuration? For example, we provided an interface to the user to say do a pinch gesture slowly and do it in a fast way, then the engine calibrates itself according to what the user is touching.
So the problem
this is the configuration of the engine itself. There is another layer of we can imagine another layer on top of the engine, which takes the gestures, and then say if we have rotate with the touch parameter, then we have the pinch. After that, we are in different. We switch in different state, and then these states can be used in applications. For example, we do rotation, then we do drag. Can be used, for example, to move inside the menu.
Not following you. Can you try and, do you want to come and sit closer to the microphone so folks on the tubes can hear?
First, we speak about the configuration of the engine itself, because there is some defines in some parameters inside the engine how we consider a gesture as, for example, a pinch. We ask the user to do pinch on his device, and it's like sort of calibration. We know that the user do pinch with such speed, so we know how the user do his gesture. This is the difference.
But you're assuming there that the speed could never be meaningful. You're assuming that there is a natural speed at which the user will do a gesture, which in turn means that the app can never attribute different semantics to different speeds, right? Whereas in fact we'd like to do the opposite. In fact, we'd like to train the user to be able to pinch at different speeds so that apps can say, oh, that's actually meaningful, right? That'd be a little bit like assuming that all mouse movements happen at the same speed. They can use speed to indicate, in fact, acceleration.
Consider the drag versus the flick.
Right.
It's all about speed.
Okay, so let me take this a different direction. If we want consistent user interfaces, but we also want to talk about user feedback and customization, what about the idea of having a gesture drawing tool where users can suggest potential gestures and then some sort of voting system so that the community can prepare wish lists and the community-wide priorities?
Again, what sorts of gestures are you talking about?
I don't know. I mean, we're trying to support the physically meaningful gestures already. So
Right. We have
I'm
a
not
gesture,
quite sure.
we have a gesture language. It's a designed gesture language. What we want is to implement that really well. And to do that well, we have to put a huge amount of effort into doing the same thing better and better and better and better, so that we figure out all the little cases where signals get dropped and so on and so forth. If we have to spend energy, I'd rather spend more energy on getting things like the basic gestures working really beautifully and smoothly and accurately than supporting the ability for, you know, random gestures to be created by somebody that will not be used by anybody else. In terms of where we put our balance of effort, making it better for everybody in a consistent way, everybody that's using the same gestures that are used in every application is much more valuable than putting effort into, you know, creating a possibility that for one person somewhere.
Are there gestures above the normal grammar? And I say above, like the example I put up there was Apple may let you do a 4-finger swipe that's customized to you, whereas things with less fingers are part of the standard grammar. I don't know if that's
right.
If
We
there
have,
are
a,
limits
we, have
to
a, we have a standard grammar which handles gestures which are initiated with up to 4 fingers. The 4-finger gestures, we don't have a lot of compounds of those, so potentially we could have people do additional things with those.
Yeah, it seems like if there's things that are undefined which are less frequently used because they're more complicated, that's a room for the user.
Right.
I think it's important to distinguish as well between what you're calling the stroke gestures and what John calls the magic gestures, and the basic gestures that we are looking at supporting in UTouch, which is what you're calling the physical gestures of just dragging things around and providing.
By
the
stroke
gesture
gestures, you mean
primitives.
things like an M and you get the mail
Yeah,
plant.
or you do a little curly
Completely,
cue. That sort of thing.
we do not want to expose that in Ubuntu, period, at all.
This is
However, there may be cases where graffiti input is useful.
Yeah.
You know, you touch in a search box and then you just write what you want anywhere on the screen.
We're not really addressing that at this point, though.
Well, there may be some similarity if the stroke that you're actually trying to do is an M, is a letter. So I do think there's value in us thinking about graffiti or handwriting recognition across multiple languages and thinking about kanji and other options there. That's useful, right?
But not for this group.
Right. Well, it's a
Well, we're
challenge.
talking multiple strokes with delays in between, right?
Yeah, I'm sure you people
Sure.
can figure it out.
Yeah, okay, I guess we can have kind of a modal thing where it permits blank periods. Anyway, sorry.
The
It's
whole,
not in scope for that.
No. So can
the whole idea of moving your mouse in a figure of 8 to get something, or, you know, those things are not.
Or just like on phones now, you long press on a text field, and that's a whole different language that comes in after that.
How do you mean long press on a text
So
field? It's a
you
different
do
language.
long press, and for example, on Android, you can choose, I want to change keyboards, just for that example.
And
So I want my gestures to be the Spanish gestures, so it's easier for me to put the accents. Or I want it to be the standard.
Yeah, we have a convention of essentially a menu on long press, which would support.
Right, so we don't need to take care of that within the rest of the graph. One other example that may come here is what about, so Pete was mentioning Windows users, and we know that a lot of people are already using that on Mac, so do we want to accommodate someone that would come from those gestures? Do we have
Well,
the equivalents?
the design that we've come to maps 1 and 2 finger gestures into the application, which is pretty accurately reflects what you do on Windows today. You know, you poke your way around inside an app, whether it's poking at icons or selecting areas or moving things around.
So
1 and 2 fingers.
As long as we're talking about
The higher order stuff for window management and shell management is where we differ, but nobody else is doing that. Or if they are, they're only just launching it, and we are going to be able to get magic trackpads in as many hands as Apple is, right?
There was a question earlier, the gentleman next to me that I don't think was answered, which is, do we differentiate between different forms of input? So between, say, a touch screen or a stylus, is that correct?
Well, yeah, well, I'm just concerned maybe even the trackpad on my MacBook Pro provides slightly different data than a Wacom touchpad, or just because they work in physically different ways oftentimes too.
That should be abstracted by the interface. As an app developer, if you want the specialist data that the Wacom stylus provides,
No, I'm not saying I
you
want
should
special
get
data. I'm saying they might actually give the data in a slightly different way, and maybe
the user experience of gestures should be the same, and the API for developers should be
right.
the
But
same.
to provide that, I'm saying, do we need to add something to the gesture recognizer to make sure that that happens? Because I'm not sure that the driver
Henrik would be the best person to answer that. And I
He's
suspect-
asking you to come closer to the mic.
Pardon?
Henrik's asking you to come closer to the mic so he can hear your thoughts.
Henrik is right for on the IoT
Yeah.
channel.
But, okay, since you mentioned Wacom, basically all you get is the XY position. So,
of each touch,
yes,
unless you're using a stylus.
right, then you get pressure.
Right. So apps that want that stylus information should be able to get it.
I believe you get pressure on the touch, like Bamboo Touch too, right?
Yeah, we're not also that. So rely on the cut capacity, system capacity.
Oh, okay, I thought the pressure was higher.
Future the capacity will be more reliable.
Yeah.
But I think we want to make make something standardized report, format or something, not just rely on the hardware. It's XY or some region standardized for all hardwares. So at the level we want to translate the touch data into gesture, we don't rely on hardware.
Yeah.
Right. The gesture should be completely independent of the hardware, unless the app wants to probe through to the underlying data and get special attributes. But that would be a special relationship between the
Yeah,
app and the
but
hardware.
that's
Well-
not clear.
That's not relevant for this. Yeah.
As far as I understand, there are 3 layers on Windows. Microsoft support. The first layer is like Unity. It's OS-wise, which only require X, Y. Since pretty much every touch device can report the points. The second layer is a little bit complicated than just 2 points. Say just take 2 points, for example. The second layer is to give you a rectangle or a region to report how many figures they have.
A bounding box?
Yeah, a box. The orientation or something like that. So you know that's a term. But that's for the sophisticated application. And the third layer is just to report whatever the hardware can report. Don't do any formatting or refining, just report the data as it is. So I think if you bound to your own and the first layer, which is abstracted format, you don't care about this part.
So my understanding is that the gesture language, we're still just talking about the coordinate values, right? We're not using any other attributes of each finger.
I think it's too early to be sure about that.
For our core language, we're not dependent on pressure or.
Yeah, the
So
core
I
language
think-
is more dependent on the individual letters of the transforms.
Right, so I think it would really simplify things if we start to solidify on just using the coordinates of the fingers and not trying. One thing that you mentioned yesterday is being able to look at the orientation of the ellipse for one finger rotation. If we start doing that, then the behavior becomes very different depending upon the input device. So the Bamboo does
Right.
not
That's
report,
what I was-
right, the Bamboo does not report the finger size or orientation at the moment. The N-trig only gives you 2 axes height and width, and you could infer that, but it just won't be as clean as some of the other devices which give you better measurements.
So what we're going to end up with then is, because of the variability of the hardware, is a workable subset of the gesture language, but it's going to depend on some hardware only does 2 touches, some does more than I have fingers.
So what is the thoughts for 2 touches? Is that in the modifier keys for additional?
What do you mean 2 touches?
The ThinkPad tablets now have 2-touch support only.
Most of the touch screens, the actual displays that have touch right now, only support 2 touches.
Okay.
You can poke your way through the interface with 2 fingers.
The design guidelines are that we support up to 4, but you can do everything with your multi-fingers through various menus with 1 finger.
Okay.
So we don't,
Well, and maybe a keyboard and maybe
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
yeah, and so I don't think we've really defined yet, an idea of, okay, well, 3 fingers, 2 fingers on the screen plus control or something. We haven't gotten to that level yet of,
Also, two fingers gives you all of the application interactions. So that's a lot of what the time you'll spend gesticulating with an application. That's supported on a 2-touch device. And then the system level actions, so the screen level interactions and the Unity level interactions, they can be performed with mouse and keyboard.
But the problem with when you're using 2 fingers plus modifier key is the ability to is when we have the tablet, not the tablet, we have no more keyboard, so we have only fingers.
How many Slate PCs support only 2-finger touch?
No, usual.
Most of the ones I've
Most of them, okay.
I don't know too many. They introduced before, I think, with the
N-trig is
firmware they have now, it's only 2.
No.
What? They changed it.
Really?
I updated my firmware and now it's only with 2.
That's news to me. When did you update?
It was a while ago, actually, but they might have fixed
There
it.
was, is it an HP?
No, that. Or TX, XT2. I have one of both. The HP has only ever done 2.
Actually, it's just 4.
Yeah, TXT.
They fixed it, but only for some versions of it.
So, what then is the scope of what we can configure? This is a question.
Yeah, sounds,
And how do we configure it?
sounds like Mark prefers that we get feedback from users and give them no control. Give the applications
I
control.
mean, you can always do your single finger magic touch stuff through third-party software as well. It wouldn't be an out-of-the-box experience.
Right.
There's nothing that we are designing that prevent, technically nothing that would prevent even single and 2-finger magic gestures. So there's always going to be that possibility.
And this is the nature of Jim, right? Because it provides you a way to come up with new gestures out of your own for your own applications. But it's not configuring the gesture engine, it's configuring some way to interpret that information for an individual application.
Just to be clear though, Mark was directing the engineering efforts of UTouch. And he was being very strong and persistent about that. He has no objection to the community doing whatever it is they want to do and having that stuff included in Ubuntu. So he doesn't want to limit the abilities of users. He just wants to make sure that our focus remains within a particular scope. Similarly, he talked about OEM services because they have a need to provide this for vendors, potentially. And he has no objection to OEM services working on this and providing this and us bringing this into the distribution. But the UTouch team itself is so limited right now. It has so few people that, and we have so much to do that we can't focus on everything. So he doesn't want to limit the freedom or the ability of the users. He wants to make sure we deliver. So if someone in the community wants to get together and start this project, I think it'd be phenomenal. He may not agree. He may not think it's phenomenal. I do think it's phenomenal, but that's neither here nor there. It's something that would be useful for some folks. So.
And I don't think there's a lot of configurable options in Grail. I don't think there's a need for it.
Mm-hmm. Outside of accessibility related stuff, yeah.
Even that, there's nothing there. That's a part of it.
I would say that if there's not a lot of options that need to be set, then absolutely don't even give them the option, because we don't need more configuration.
The only place I could see possible configuration would be at the different hardware.
Exactly.
And that's more of something to provide to OEMs.
Exactly. Right. Because like when, you know,
That's
Dell or
the-
HP may come to us and say, we can't stand these gestures, we don't want our users to use these gestures, they have to be doing this gesture instead. You know, if we're going to be partners with them, there's a good chance we're going to have to comply at some level to that. And so they can either go in and change the header files and redefine what the gestures are, or a system of configuration can be done so that every vendor that came up, we could just make a configuration change.
So I tend to agree with John that we need to keep our own standard gestures. I can understand that an OEM may say, I just want it to work like the iPhone, but we don't.
Well, our preferred approach, as we're kind of starting this off and try to leave this within minutes, is to create standardization.
Yeah.
So if HP come to us and say, we've got a real problem with this gesture, we need to listen to what their problem is, and we need to standardize on a solution. You know, there's give and take from both directions.
Yes.
If another company or another vendor comes to us and says there's a problem, it's in all of our interests to create a standard. It's not in our interest to fragment what gestures do.
Right.
That's our number one objective.
And the thing is, it comes down to, it's like, if there's a $5 million deal in the offing, and we're saying, no, you can't do 2 fingers, you have to do 1.
I question whether they would actually kill a $5 million deal just because you can't do it.
Understood, but I'm not saying it's a likelihood, I'm saying that we should entertain this possibility.
Yeah, I mean, longevity ability, that's great, but I'm telling you from my perspective, I would avoid it at all costs.
Right.
Yeah, it was fine.
Okay, but part of what Stephen was saying about being able to configure it for each device, really what we're talking about is building a database of the different hardware so that we can make it as consistent as possible.
Yes, that's all I was really saying.
So,
and that's where talking to OEMs comes into it. They put some particular device in there, and it's got to be tweaked for them.
right, so I think we're really talking more about OEM services interacting with companies before the products are released. And I guess probably depending upon users for bug reports for something doesn't act, at least beyond our own ability to test as much as we can. Get feedback from the users to tell us where we need.
So do we think there are any options that can be offered? Like, I mean, pressure sensitivity, we were talking about time for double click, any of that stuff?
Well,
We can't go on pressure sensitivity on the hardware supports it.
and times for double clicks is more in the realm of the applications or the toolkits rather than the UTouch stack.
What about the acceleration or anything like that for swipes?
I would think that the 2-finger drags, the 3-finger drags, wouldn't we want a similar acceleration? We'd either want a direct physical mapping or we'd
look
want
at a small touchpad and you're doing a 4-finger drag and you're looking at a big screen. Your at least relative movement over time is going to be very different, right? Because you're actually moving a larger physical.
It's going to be the same. So I don't know. Henrik can probably.
I mean, part of the nature of the flick is your hand is physically accelerating and you let go and the object maintains inertia with friction. So that's still following the physical model. That's not a scaling.
I think this, I don't know if this is scaling, but you just said friction. And I think maybe one thing I'm concerned about is I definitely agree on the need for consistency in the experience, but do we get that just by having the standard gestures and then providing the same values? Because I see different people implementing widgets, and although they get the same input data, that doesn't mean they use it to provide the same visual feedback or sort of user experience in general.
So there are two parts of this. There's providing the gesture language for interpreting the drag, interpreting the flick, the consistent way, and then there's using it in a consistent way. We had a session yesterday, looking around the room, quite a few people who weren't there, which was talking about the gesture language, sorry, not the gesture language, the gesture design guidelines, and all of that. There was a scheduling problem, so it didn't come up on the system. So anyone who wasn't there, if you want to go to design.canonical.com/toolkit and look under Unity, there's the gesture guidelines there, which talks about these things and get consistency in the second half of this problem. And any questions, speak to me. And if there are a lot of people who didn't make their session yesterday and would like to contribute, we could possibly do it again.
So it seems like we discussed a lot, but do we determine any sections beyond that we need to have a consistent set of gestures?
I think what we've determined is that there really isn't a lot of configuration.
Certainly not when the focus is to be as physically, to follow the physical motion metaphors. I mean, that really is just tweaking our interpretation to be as correct as possible.
Well, for application developers, though, we are giving them the multi-touch input streams for 1 and 2 fingers, and if they're going to be remote, we're giving them the multi-touch input streams for more fingers. So that when you have an application that does go outside the bounds of what our gestures, our basic gesture parameters do. So, there's the finger painting application, there's the DJing application, all these types of things. We do provide that to the application, so the application can interpret them in a custom way and do the things for those kind of special applications needed.
I have a question for you. Along with the guidelines of how to interpret things like a flick, are we going to be providing sample codes with tutorials? So a flick, we could really show, here we've got a sprite, there's a lighting thing, or whatever. This is the equation of motion that we follow with the flick. That's roughly equivalent to our design guidelines. Will there be tutorial code like that available?
That would be great. Jason?
Isn't just flicking through a PDF a tutorial, in essence? You get the experience of...
Well, I'm talking a tutorial for the developers.
To be able to match.
So one of the best ways that we can get consistency is to provide code freely that everyone is welcome to just grab and use. Because if they use the same equations...
They will copy and paste instead of reading.
There is a session on that later in the week, too.
Okay.
Part of this is just going to be the fact that most of this is implemented in the toolkit, in Qt or in GTK. Your typical scrolling, zooming, I assume, I don't really know the toolkit layer too much, but I assume like if you have a picture, you would just say, or like, if you have a canvas, you would just say that this is scrollable and it's also zoomable, and then
The toolkit would intercept those particular gestures and do the appropriate thing.
Is that guys how you currently handle it? Like Memo from Qt?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay.
That's exactly how it works. Basically, if you have a scroll area, it automatically subscribes to the pen gesture, scroll gesture, and if there is a hardware available and the produces special attachments, it will just scroll when you do a 2-finger or 1-finger interaction.
And the application developer would have to take specific action if they want to get that gesture reported to a widget, and then they'd have to do something with that information.
Yeah. So I think in a sense, the 1 and 2 finger movements, for the most part, in most circumstances, are pretty intuitive. They're zoom, they rotate, they're drag around. It's the 3 and 4 finger stuff that isn't quite intuitive, and those are the levels that we are aiming for. Window management, Unity functions, and developers, unless they're doing like an AutoCAD, a very specialized piece of software, likely are not going to be interested in 3 and 4 finger touches. If not only because we still have a hard time finding 3 and 4 finger touches, so just to reach everyone, standardizing on 1 and 2 fingers for typical application stuff would be easier.
Are you limiting this to single user sort of laptops?
But right now, the architecture doesn't. We have ideas as to how we can expand it out to a table type thing using heuristics and things. But right now, it's aimed at one hand
Our scope
at a
for
time.
Manny is purely
Yeah, no, I was
single
just
user.
I would say, like, if I were to try and, I'd say probably we could begin looking at that, a multi-user environment. Maybe a multi-hand user environment we could look at in the next cycle or one more cycle. And then a multi-user table thing is probably like a year or two away before we get a chance to look at
LTS
it.
fast.
Do you have any heuristics in terms of? I'm trying to think. Like I'm thinking, okay, like if I have just a laptop touchscreen too.
Mhm.
If I have more than 2 finger support, maybe I have an application where I use 2 fingers to scroll through something.
Yeah.
But I use a 3rd finger somewhere
Yeah.
else on the buttons to
Yeah.
toggle the mode or switch
So-
one layer of the map I'm looking at.
Yeah, I think that level of support, which is a little different than just multi-user.
Well, are you talking
layers.
separate windows or single?
No.
Well,
Same-
separate
same
widgets,
with-
separate
separate
windows,
widgets,
whatever.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
windows.
that's the only tricky part there really is at the level of ensuring that you're doing 2 fingers here, 1 finger there. It doesn't get picked up as a single
Right,
3-finger gesture by the window manager. And in a sense, it's not coded up in the UTouch framework right now to be able to heuristically separate those. But that is probably not a really difficult thing. I think we probably would
I'm
get,
not sure that's a trivial problem.
But a lot of
yeah.
that code will be related to multi-user.
yeah.
So being able to support multiple gestures in parallel.
So yeah, it is
That
somewhat
becomes a
heuristic.
scary question.
It is somewhat
Well, yeah, you
heuristic.
can go time and space, but
Yeah, it would be a best effort type thing. You know, you get too close and it's like, well, sorry, you're too close, and so the user just has to kind of expect a little bit that, you know, you got to be scrolling reasonably far enough apart, or else it's going to be seen as whatever it should be seen as.
From the application point of view, you're just going to be getting separate gestures once it recognizes it as 2 users or 2 hands, or they're just 2 separate gestures.
yeah, I was concerned that it would confuse it as well.
Yeah.
No,
So to
that's
some
all
extent,
working
I think
well. We don't need to worry about that at this point.
very few users would move 3 fingers together and actually expect it to get treated as 2 fingers and 1 finger separately. There probably are people who will do that out of spite, and people who really honestly.
You might run into people using 2 hands for rotation because it's really awkward to use 1 hand on the screen.
Right.
But that's 1 gesture. You know, if you're trying to chase your fingers around as 2 separate gestures.
So certainly once we start talking about larger surfaces, like photo manipulation, then 2 fingers and separate hands at large distances is a specific desirable usage case. But then both fingers are on the same target.
But not.
And the
Yes,
target
because
is.
Yeah, the toolkits get to say this area, this one area, this area is another.
Yeah, that's the toolkit's job.
So, well, no, to the
It's
gesture.
a gesture.
So does
Get
the
to tell
gesture end?
engine.
Yeah, it has to tell it what the areas are.
So will tools be able to tell the grace trial when we send the touch event for the recognition to gaze guys? Will we be able to say that those touches kind of related to 1 gesture recognition context, to 1 basically widgets inside the top level window?
So a shape.
Yeah, well,
So
probably not the shape.
these are the gesture subscriptions for this shape.
I would like to explicitly say that even if all 3 touches are kind of in the same rect, but I would like to be able to separate that those 2 touches are for 1 recognition, and the 3rd touch is for different kind of gesture. Because internally we know like that we have overlapping widgets inside the level, and they technically they're on the
So
same level.
this comes into the compound gesture language, right? So-
I'm not sure. This is something
You
that we
think-
have to discuss.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is all the guys to.
This is more touch propagation and gestures recognition based on that.
That's exciting.
Well, I mean, it's a question of, do we get to configure the context in which the input is interpreted? Do we
I'm
get
not
to
sure
say-
that you'd want to, how would you configure that?
Do I get to tell the gesture engine? This
Oh,
is-
the software doesn't get to tell the gesture. Yeah, and in a sense, the architecture that we're going towards is a little bit more of the toolkit takes touches and sends them onto the recognizer as it sees appropriate. Does that sort of answer the?
Yeah, but now, when we send those touches for the recognition, I would like to kind of add some kind of ID context, gesture, recognition
I think
context.
that's going to be required.
Yeah. So you want to be able to say, like, there's a big, you want to be able to say there's a big region, and over here, I know that this is one hand, over here is another hand, so recognize that side.
Well, I don't necessarily need to call gestures in one region, right? I just want to say,
You need to take
here's some
Yeah,
touches
yeah,
together and
yeah,
show these
yeah.
together. And on
So yeah. And I thought about that a little bit.
It's like a session on top of the touch session.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, maybe your touch session.
I think we have a separate
So-
topic to discuss this.
Yeah, just briefly.
Yeah, but this topic died.
In the architecture that we are looking at, you would send those touches separately. Like you would send to Grail, you'd say, I got these touches, recognize. And then you send, I got these touches, recognize. And so,
I suspect what we're going to have to do is Gray will have no concept of the regions. That's all in the toolkit. Toolkit has to tag them as being in the same region, but it's up to the toolkit to interpret what the regions are. They could be physical regions or it could be.
Are you doing that by, based on the widget ID, window ID, right? Because you have a
right now.
I think it will just
All right.
You know, this is kind of
I think it will just be a context.
Yeah, I
Context
think
which does not map to
we're
window
just going to
ID.
have to get rid of the window ID.
Right.
Right. It doesn't watch files and it's
Right.